Hello everybody, so we're going to walk through how to set up a new Blazor application. Let's get started. So what I have here is just a new Visual Studio window. I'm going to go to create new project just like anything else, and I'm going to do a search for Blazor, and I'm going to see a couple different things come up. In particular, I want to focus on this Blazor server app and Blazor WebAssembly app. So I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between those two. So a Blazor server app is going to be a server-side rendering application. So we're going to set up these Razor template files, we're going to write our code, and everything's going to execute server-side. Now I'm going to contrast that with a Blazor WebAssembly app. So how this one works is a little bit different. What it's actually going to do is it's going to compile your code down into some WebAssembly that can be sent to a client server along with a very small container of the .NET runtime, and it's going to run everything client side. So that's going to be the distinction between these two different versions. The server app is going to run on the server side, and WebAssembly is going to run on the client side. So whenever someone goes to your website, they're going to download your code and run everything from there. There's also a few more things, in particular this .NET MAUI Blazor app. This is for more native application development, especially in like the mobile space. So that's just kind of beyond what I want to talk about today. Today I want to talk about Blazor server applications. And the reason I want to do server applications is they might not scale quite as well as the WebAssembly apps because you're having to run all of this extra code on the server, but they are a lot easier to work with when you're just starting out. So that's what we're going to set up here. I don't need any particular authentication type. If I was wanting to do user accounts, I could set that up here. If I wanted to enable Docker and run this on a particular Docker instance, I could do that without too much fuss. For me, I want to use .NET 6 and no top-level statements because that's just the settings that I like. Okay, so now Visual Studio is all loaded up here. So let's take a look at what it's pre-made for. So if I open up the Solution Explorer, I'm going to see a few different folders kind of all laid out. The first one I'm going to talk about is this launch settings.json. This is where you're going to do configuration for your server. So whenever you're doing testing and development work and you want to make sure that this is running on all the right ports and everything's set up how you like, this is where you'll go to make those changes. We also have a www root. This is where you'll set up stuff like favicons, any special CSS rules you want. This is where our local instance of Bootstrap is being pulled in from. This is just general web dev sort of stuff. Now, we also have this data folder, which I don't really like. We're going to talk about that more detail in a moment. But we can see we just have a very simple class and a very simple service that provides things for that particular type of data for that class. So here we can see we have some sort of class that contains a really big array of summaries. We have all this stuff, and we have this get forecast async, which for a given time generates some random data to return as an array. So this is just a random data generator used for testing. Also have a pages folder, which lays out some very simple HTML pages to render and go through. But you might notice, hey, some of this HTML doesn't look quite right. Some of it looks a little bit different. And that's totally correct because this is actually a little bit beyond normal HTML. This is actually a .razor file. .razor file is .NET's implementation of a templating system. Templating systems are very common, especially in the modern web development space. So how this is going to work is it's going to go through and read through this file and treat it mostly like normal HTML. It's going to be the HTML you think of when you think of HTML. But it's going to have these little @ tags. Every templating system is going to work a little bit differently, but in Razor files, it's this @ for each. It's @ if, that sort of thing. And what that shows is it says, hey, this next thing is going to be some code. This is going to be some code. Treat the next couple of things like code. After that, I can use curly brackets just like I would for any other C# file. And once I'm inside, I can go back to writing HTML, just like the HTML we all know and love. We can also open up a @code bracket. Traditionally, this is found at the bottom of the file, but it can actually kind of go anywhere. But this is going to be for anything that's particular to that page, right? So this isn't some generic service. This is very specific code specifically to run on this page. So for this one, we are getting all this weather forecast data from the weather forecasting service. And I know we're getting that from the weather forecasting service because up here at the top, I can see where we are saying to, hey, use this data and inject the service. We'll talk a little bit more about dependency injection and what all that means in a few moments. But we're going to get that data so that we have it in this forecast array. Here we can see we have a for each loop where we're going through a forecast array. So this just all lines up exactly the way we would expect it to. We have a few more that I really recommend just not touching right now. As you develop your skills and get more involved in Blazor and the ecosystem around it, feel free to dive in. But this host.cs, HTML, layout, error, those are things I really recommend just not touching at this point. We also have some example files for fetching the data. That just works with their weather service. We have a very simple index page. We also have this next folder called shared. Now shared is for common components that are going to be injected into your web page. So if you're familiar at all with the idea of React components, it's basically just these little tiny web pages and these little snippets of HTML that get inserted and injected into a different HTML page. So that lets you kind of reuse some code. You don't have to write quite as much, and everything just kind of flows a little bit easier. It's a little bit more compartmentalized. Now, I said before that I don't really like this layout. So a very common background for writing this sort of UI-based controller is for something called MVC. It stands for Model View Controller. Now, Blazor doesn't completely adhere to the philosophy of Model View Controller, but it gets pretty close. And for how I like to structure my projects, I like to follow that sort of pattern. So how I'd like to do this is I would actually like to break this folder up. I don't like that. I like for there to be another folder here. Let's go to Add, New Folder, and I'm going to call this one Services. And what I'd like to do is I like to actually separate my data model from the services, just physically in the structure of the files, just to make it a little bit more clear between, hey, what is and isn't working, this is data, this is functionality, and that just kind of helps me logically break down my file. So what should go in the data folder now is the stereotypical records, data holders, structures, that sort of thing. And services are going to be more like coordinators and, well, services, right? Things that are actually going to do things with the data that exist. Now, when we do change that structure of our program, that's actually going to change a few other things. So let's hop over to program.cs, and here we can see where we actually go through and register all of our different services that our app's going to be using. And that all kind of makes sense. But there is one thing to be on the lookout for, is we have now actually moved that file into a different folder. That folder now lives in a different place. It may not be quite where we're expecting. So it looks like when I moved it, it went ahead and changed the namespace for me. That's great. Let's go over and check the fetchdata.razor file. That's where we actually use it, and yes, we can see we've got an error. Perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. And the reason why it's saying, hey, this doesn't exist is because, well, it's no longer in this using statement, right? So this @using is for saying, hey, we've got some data at this folder, I would like to use it. But we also have stuff in Blazor example .services. So once I say, hey, I'm also using this package, this folder, everything should just start to work correctly after that. Now, the other thing I would like to talk about over in program.cs is this idea of registering services and adding singletons. Now, I'll share some blog posts about what a singleton is and kind of what that means under the hood, but this is where you'll go to register your services. In short, as we go through and we add these new services, what I'd like to see is we open up this bracket, and first we want to typically pass in some sort of interface. So some sort of I collection or whatever you have it, and then you're going to have your actual implementation. So that's where we would use our whatever service we create. That's going to allow us to do some interface segregation and some dependency injection and all this other really good solid programming techniques. Okay, so that walks us through everything you need to know to get started with the Blazor application. Thanks for watching.